I've travelled far to be here today, past rain-swollen lochs, through windy glens, to reach the west coast of Scotland. Morvern, to be precise, one of the remotest points on the mainland. In 2017, a new distillery was founded here, with the aim of making whisky in a way that is as completely in tune with its local natural environment as is possible. Welcome to Nc'nean. I'm in the bar now at Nc'nean Distillery with Annabel Thomas, the founder. Thank you so much for welcoming us.
Thank you for making the effort to get all the way here.
Morvern is not exactly on the beaten track. We're pretty remote here. How did the idea for a distillery at this place come about?
We are on my parents' farm at the moment, so that was the kind of original genesis of the idea, if you like. You can't really be on the west coast here, I think, and not think about whiskey. So that was the original nub of the idea. We thought, oh, wouldn't it be amazing to have a distillery here? And I said to my family, well, we just keep talking about it. Why don't I spend some time actually working on it and we'll see what comes of it. So I did some desk work and we also did a trip to Islay. And it was really while I was in Islay that things started to take shape in my mind more, because I felt like all the distilleries on Islay at the time were very traditional, and there's absolutely a place for that in Scotch, and I think it's amazing. But I felt like, you know, there's also a place for a more modern, maybe forward-looking distillery as well. And that was the point I realised, yes, this is something I have to do. But it then took us quite a long time to get from that to an actual distillery, but that's always the way.
So it sort of felt like whiskey country from the beginning. And actually, there is a sort of little cluster of distilleries around this area. You have some distillery neighbours?
We do. We have Tobermory just across the water that way, and we have Ardnamurchan just over the hill and across some more water that way. We know the guys at Ardnamurchan really well because they're obviously also a new distillery. They also have a biomass boiler. They started a couple of years before us, so they're on a very similar journey to us, and we share training and forklifts and all sorts with them when we run out of things or things break.
I find that often the mark of a great Scotch whisky is a name that isn't super straightforward to pronounce, and you've got that really nailed down. So how did you come by the name Nc'nean, and am I pronouncing it close to correctly?
You are pronouncing it perfectly. The mission of the distillery is to do things as sustainably as possible, to pioneer those kind of new elements of sustainable production that maybe the rest of the industry is not doing, and also to think creatively about the spirits that we actually make. And we wanted to find a name that symbolises those two things, rather than doing what most other distilleries do, which is base it on the name of the place. So we found a Gaelic goddess called Nc'nean, who was known as a protector of nature and for walking her own path, and we thought, well, that's perfect, that's what we're trying to do. That is even harder to pronounce than Nc'nean, 13 letters. We thought, well, we'll condense it into something shorter and a bit more readable, and in doing so, we still ended up with something quite unpronounceable. You would be amazed how often it is written as Mucknean, or read as Mucknean, even though it clearly is not. But people are so used to seeing Muck, which means son of, that's just how they read it, and Nook means daughter of.
Well, maybe that trail blazed, maybe a few more Nooks will start to pop up around. That'll be lovely. So a lot of Scotch whisky distilleries were founded well over a century ago, in a sort of golden age when pleasures were simple, the sun was always shining, and CO2 had yet to be invented. But Nc'nean, Ardnamurchan, lots of distilleries have been founded in a time when we're actually much more conscious of the impact that we as humans have with any and all of our activities. What advantages did you have actually building a distillery from the ground up with the idea of being sustainable?
We definitely had advantages, and in particular what we do on site here is much easier if you're starting from a blank sheet of paper, as it were. And in particular we put in a biomass boiler, which is kind of the hub of our sustainability on site. We chose it mostly because we have commercial forest right here. The thing with sustainability is you've always got to work with what you've got. One answer for one person is not the right answer for another distillery. And so we chose to put in a biomass boiler, and that is expensive, hard to work with, and probably quite hard to retrofit. So from that point of view, we had a great advantage. There are other areas though where it's not so much a new versus old thing. It's just a question of really doing the research and making the effort, and sometimes making some expensive choices. Organic barley being a good example.
The barley, is Morvern a good part of the country for growing barley, or do you have to bring it from?
No, virtually nowhere on the west coast is good for growing barley. All of our farmers are over on the east. But given that's where also the maltsters are, it's not so bad.
So barley is grown, malted, and arrives here to be worked with.
Exactly.
I notice also that your glassware is very, very beautiful, and there's a slight greenish tinge to it, which actually plays into the character of the whiskey itself, but also that greenish tinge is a sign of a sustainable practice as well.
It is. So we spent a long time we'd done all of the, the big sustainability initiatives when we built the distillery, like biomass and organic and water recycling and things, and then we had a bit of a pause while we laid down the whiskey. Came to the packaging, and we really wanted to find a glass bottle with a very high percentage recycled content, but whilst it was still clear, because I really want people to see the colour of the whiskey, especially when you're a new brand. I think it's important to, that people can see what they're buying. Anyway, we searched and searched, we could find nothing, and eventually we found a company at a trade show, completely coincidentally, who are making 100% recycled clear glass bottle, first in the world as far as we know. So we were, timing-wise, we were extremely lucky. We basically had to throw away the design work we'd already done, start again with this new bottle, but we love it. And it's slightly green because of that recycled content. It also has sometimes some bubbles and things in it, kind of imperfections, which is because they've put a principle on the line that makes it, which is basically a lower quality threshold tolerance. So normally it would be sort of no bubbles. Anything that comes out with bubbles goes straight back in the furnace, but it just means the whole thing is much lower carbon footprint.
So clearly all of these different approaches have been bearing fruit, because Nc'nean is now the first and I think still only net zero distillery in the UK, and that's 20 years ahead of government targets. Did you have to make a lot of sacrifices to get to that point, or did it actually flow quite easily?
Indeed. Well, so we're verified net zero for our distillery, which is scope 1 and 2 in technical sustainable language. That means that everything we do on site is as low carbon emissions as possible, and then we've offset the small amount that remains. The core of all of that is our biomass boiler. That is a renewable process. We harvest the timber just here, replant whatever we harvest. Having said that, the actual carbon footprinting process was both very difficult and eye-opening. It is extremely complicated. There's not very much data out there. And it really made me realise how far the world has to go to get to a stage where everybody knows what their carbon footprint is, because really, if you can't measure it, you can't do anything about it. So in terms of sacrifices, yes, I think having a biomass boiler is a sacrifice. It's extremely expensive to put in, and it's much more difficult for the team to run. It's, we have to harvest the wood a couple of years in advance. We have to chip the wood ourselves. We have to deal with a boiler that is extremely complicated for really what it's doing. So it's it's tough.
It is tough, but it's not an obstacle, because last year, in the middle of a pandemic, not the ideal time, but you did release your first whiskey. The 3 years of maturation was up, and you brought Nc'nean Whisky into the world. How does it feel to kind of bring out a whole new whiskey?
Well, wonderful. Although I have to say, given that point had been coming for 7 years, I did not envisage that it would be in the middle of a global pandemic that we would launch it. But yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it's a funny thing about building a whiskey distillery. It's such a journey. We did the fundraising to begin with, and once we had the funds, we thought, yes. And then we built the distillery, and then we had the distillery and thought, yes. And then you get to actually having whiskey in a bottle. And in some ways, that's another major milestone, but you've still got the whole future ahead of you. But yeah, it was wonderful. And I guess what was even better actually was the reaction to it, because it's also quite nerve-wracking putting it out there in the world for the first time for people to pass judgment on.
So the whiskey is out there and people do love it. I really like the whiskey, and but there's not a huge amount of production that can happen here. It's sort of quite limited in quantity, isn't it?
Indeed. Well, we're a very small site, which limits how much we can produce, but also it's something. I always wanted this to be a limited thing. Compared to a lot of distilleries in Scotland, we're really very small. We're kind of at the smallest, I'd say, commercially viable end.
To the core of the matter, how is Nc'nean Whisky actually made?
So the barley we've talked a bit about is organic Scottish barley, 100%. And water comes off the hill from a spring up the hill. And then yeast is a point we're very passionate about. We use 2 yeasts. Well, we actually run multiple recipes through the distillery. So there is no one answer to your question, but for our core recipe, which is what you find in our bottles now, we use 2 yeasts, one classic distilling yeast, one yeast that was originally developed for wine. So the barley and the yeast have really important impacts on the final flavour. So from an actual production point of view, we have traditional distilling equipment. I mean, there's not very much leeway in Scotland to do anything else. We mill our barley on site to a classic 70-20-10 proportions. We mash on site. We mash slowly. We let it sit for an hour, which is quite unusual, and then we recirculate until it's very clear wort. I've talked about the yeast, that's very important, but we ferment for between 66 and 114 hours. 2/5 of what we produce is at the longer end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that is pretty long.
It is
going
long.
over 100 considerably, yeah.
Yeah. And then we obviously distill. 2 copper pot stills. We distill slowly and gently for lots of copper contact, and we have for our core recipe, we have a relatively high cut point in the stills. So we're aiming for something that is pure, and that's the slow distillation high cut point, but also fruity and flavourful, and that really comes from the fermentation stage. If you don't get those fruity flavours in the fermentation stage, you're not going to end up with them in the spirit. But then we have other recipes that we run through the distillery as well. We have what we call the old recipe, not very creatively named, because it is for spirit that we intend to mature for a long time. So at least 10 years old. It is much more of a kind of classic Scotch recipe and fundamentally lower cut points. That's the key to it.
Right. But still using the different yeasts to produce.
No, we don't bother with the different yeasts because the longer you leave something in a cask, the less influence of the spirit you have. Yeah. So whilst we could use different yeasts, we sort of don't bother because we know it's going to be in the cask for more than 10 years, and really it's not going to make much difference in that period of time. And then the third thing we do is run yeast experiments. So that is on the core recipe, so it's got the higher cut points and so on, but we throw extra yeast in alongside the 2 we already use. And they could be anything. So we've done yeast that were designed for making rum, yeast that were designed for making wine. This year we are doing, I think, tequila and a beer yeast. Okay. So all sorts of different things, and hopefully none of that has made it out into the world yet, so it's all still in our warehouse, and hopefully we'll have something to show the world in 2022 for that.
Yeah. Like a sort of traditional view of whiskey is keep it in the cask for as long as you can because older whiskey is better whiskey. But actually, yeah, you're right. It's sort of older and younger whiskey are kind of quite different from each other. If it's in the cask for a long time, the cask has a big effect. But if you're intending to release something that's a little more youthful, tweak the yeast recipes, tweak how you cut with the barley, because the distillery character will be much stronger at that point. And so these are 2 very different products, and you're kind of anticipating that from the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not a great believer in this older is better. I think there are pros and cons to everything. Yeah. But my passion is in the spirit, actually. I think what you can do in a distillery is amazing, and I think that's often overlooked, and that's why we're trying to do all this work with yeast and things to really show what can be done. And I think if you plan to mature everything for 10 years, then you can just come do what you want in the distillery, and it fades into nothingness. No, it's not true, but for all of the experimentation that we do in the distillery, we need to release it relatively young for people to really be able to see the impact of it.
But of course, the cask maturation is a mandated part of making Scotch whisky, at least for 3 years, but maybe much longer. So our favourite subject at Cask 88, what is your cask policy?
Most of the casks in our warehouse are a mix of STR red wine casks and ex-bourbon. So STR is shaved, toast and recharred, Spanish red wine casks. But we also have lots of other interesting casks in there. So the special edition that we've just brought out had some ex-Tokai barrels in it. We've got some tequila. We've released a tequila single cask already this year, and we've got other interesting ones up there that will be for future releases.
I did wonder when tequila casks would be finding their way onto the scene, because I know that there were certain restrictions that were lifted a couple of years ago, and that opened the door to tequila, and I'm wondering, who's going to do that first? Of course Nc'nean does it first.
Well, actually, I believe Kilchoman did it first.
Did they?
Yes.
I missed that.
Yes, they did. It was quite under the radar, indeed. Chivas also did a blend with tequila cask in, but I think Kilchoman did it first, but they didn't make a big song and dance of it. And to be honest, we didn't actually know that, so we thought we were the first, but it turned out we weren't. But we weren't doing it to be the first, we were just doing it because it was delicious.
Yeah, I can imagine, like a good tequila, very, very different from whiskey, but with some really exciting flavours in it. So I'd love to see how the two play together.
But I mean, really, we are all about sustainability on the one hand, and I guess walking our own path on the other, and that encompasses many things. That's from doing different recipes in the distillery, to not worrying about not having crystal clear glass, to encouraging people to drink our whiskey with soda rather than neat, because I think I would like to encourage the next generation of Scotch drinkers to come in, and maybe I'm a great believer that only feeling like you can only drink whiskey neat is quite a barrier for some people, and saying it's okay to try it in a different way if you don't like drinking neat alcohol, which many people don't. I'm a great believer in, so that's another thing that we're trying to.
There is actually a recipe for a cocktail that Nc'nean is part of, which is quite iconic now to Nc'nean. So how would you make that one quickly?
A whiskey 6. So the clue is in the title. 2 parts whiskey, 4 parts soda, make 6. Over ice, drink it at 6 o'clock. It's as simple as that. Garnish it with mint if you have some.
Mint. So that's an interesting twist. Whiskey and mint. There are some cocktails that do that, but this sort of plays it very, very simple. So you really get those flavours.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I think is amazing about whiskey and soda. It's not you're not drowning in anything sweet. You are, and actually the soda allows the whiskey to shine through rather than be overpowered. So,
what happens next for Nc'nean?
Yes, well, we've just done our first seasonal release, which we called Quiet Rebels. That was, and each of those kind of are basically created by one of our team, and I got to go first on this one. So that will be coming out every autumn from now on. It will be a different member of the team each time. And our next lot of seasonal releases will come out every spring. We don't even have a name for them yet, so watch this space. But we do have our eyes on the liquid, so that's quite exciting. We're figuring out what the right liquid is literally this month. So
that's exciting. And Quiet Rebels, that's kind of the collective name for your team.
It is indeed. It kind of, we're quite a different bunch of people, not who you'd maybe normally expect to find in a whiskey distillery. So yeah, it's just the way we like to describe ourselves.
So a lovely all-natural whiskey made in a thoroughly beautiful corner of the country. Nc'nean, friend of nature, friend of whiskey drinkers, and Annabel Thomas, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for coming to visit us.
If you'd like to stay up to date with Cask 88's adventures in the world of whiskey, then like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.